Somewhere deep in the frozen woods of Minnesota, a young officer found a dog, barely breathing, tied in a bag, sinking beneath the ice. What he did next wasn't part of any training manual. It came from something deeper, a bond forged in silence and survival. But what if that rescue was just the beginning? Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. And if stories of love, courage, and second chances move you, don't forget to hit subscribe and stay with us to the end. Hallow Ridge, Minnesota, sat muted beneath a sky the color of old steel. The lake, once alive with laughter and summer canoes, was now a single breath away from being lost beneath winter's glassy silence. Pines stood stiff along the shoreline, their spindly shadows frozen in place. The snow that blanketed the region wasn't fresh. It was hardened, wind-crusted, and brutal, the kind of snow that could silence even memory. On that January morning, the temperature hovered at 4 degrees Fahrenheit, and not even the birds dared speak. Officer Jonah Hale's cruiser idled at the edge of Route 12, its tires crunching slowly over the icy gravel that skirted Hallow Ridge Lake. The air inside the vehicle was sharp despite the heater murmuring at full power. Jonah, 31, sat upright in the driver's seat, window cracked just enough to let the sting of cold keep him alert. His face was lean and sun-worn, with a perpetual shadow along his jawline that hinted at long shifts and sleepless nights. He had the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but quietly commanded it. 6 feet tall, wiry, with shoulders slightly stooped as if bracing for news that never stopped coming. His gray eyes, flecked with pale green, often looked distant, as though somewhere in the space between thought and memory, he was still chasing ghosts. It had been nearly a year since his younger brother, Levi, died in a blizzard accident along this same route. Jonah had arrived minutes too late. The snow had swallowed the wreckage whole. He never forgave the silence that followed. That morning, he hadn't expected anything more than routine patrol. But as he reached the west bend of the lake, a curve wrapped in bramble and leaning pine, his eyes caught a flicker. At first, he thought it was just the wind nudging the snow's brittle crust. But it moved again, slower this time, struggling. He eased the cruiser to a halt, stepped out, and the cold rushed at him with sharp fingers. His boots cracked the thin crust as he approached the lake's edge. That was when he saw it clearly. Something small caught in the fractured circle of dark ice. It was moving barely. The lake had cracked into a webbed pattern, delicate and deadly, and in its center, something black and tan was slipping in and out of the water. A dog. Puppy by the look of it. No more than 5 months old, fur slicked down to skin, paws scrambling for purchase on the brittle edge. Its muzzle barely surfaced, ears pinned back, breath shallow and irregular. There was a whimper, short, hoarse, as if sound itself had frozen. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. His training screamed protocol. Call dispatch, wait for animal control, don't jeopardize your own safety. But there were moments when procedure had to bow to instinct. Some silences couldn't be tolerated. He dropped his radio, tore off his jacket, and sprinted forward. The surface cracked beneath his boots, a sound like bones breaking. One more step and the ice gave way with a sharp exhale, dragging him into the lake's breathless grasp. The cold hit like a sledgehammer. It bit through layers, through muscle and marrow, into the very root of him. For a heartbeat he forgot how to move. But then he saw the pup again. Its eyes locked onto his, and he lunged forward. His hand collided with soaked fur, thin and trembling. He wrapped his arm around the small body, tucked it against his chest, and kicked upward. The surface shattered as he burst through. Both bodies, man and dog, spilled onto the snowy bank, shivering violently. The wind picked up as if to erase the scene, brushing white over everything. Jonah lay gasping, his hands already blue, but he didn't let go. The pup didn't cry. It just clung. 100 yards away, behind a sloped ridge of pine, a wooden cabin sat with its curtains drawn. Inside, Loretta Quinn washed the same mug twice. Loretta was 44, angular and pale with sharp cheekbones and faint freckles across a narrow nose. Her red-brown hair was pulled back into a loose braid, a few silver strands escaping near her temples. She wore oversized knit sweaters and fleece-lined boots that had long lost their newness. She wasn't tall, nor particularly striking at first glance, but something about her movements, calculated, quiet, suggested a life once full of sound. She had moved to Hallowridge 3 years earlier after the accident. A collision during a snowstorm had robbed her daughter, Myra, of her speech. Since then, Loretta had spoken little herself. She'd traded social circles for pine trees and ceramic tools. These days, she sculpted figures from river stone and kept to herself. No one in town saw her much except at the feed store or the winter market, where she sold tiny stone foxes and carved owls with unblinking eyes. That morning something felt wrong. She had dreamt of water, black and glassy, swallowing light. So when she heard a sharp crack echo from the lake beyond the ridge, she froze mid-step. Her hands, still wet, trembled slightly. She peered through the cabin window, but all she saw were snow and trees, like always. Yet, there it was, a flicker, distant but unmistakable movement, breath against white. She didn't move. Instead, she turned and stepped deeper into the cabin. A fire had burned low in the hearth, its embers muted like everything else in her world. Myra, age 7, was still asleep in the loft above, curled in quilts Loretta had sewn herself. Outside, the wind carried stories Loretta didn't want to hear. At the lake, Jonah's arms tightened around the pup. He stumbled to his feet, water dripping from his sleeves. The dog was limp but breathing. His car was too far and the roads too slick. So he turned uphill, toward the old cabin his father had built decades ago, the place he hadn't entered since Levi died. The door stuck as he shoved it open with his shoulder, carrying his soaked burden inside. The room smelled of old pine and ash. Everything was where his father left it. Iron kettle, rusted lantern, and a dusty stack of flannel blankets. Jonah dropped to his knees by the cold hearth and laid the pup on a thick rug. His body was curled unnaturally, still dripping. He threw wood into the fireplace, struck a match, and watched the flames claw their way to life. "You're not done," he whispered, voice hoarse. "Not today." He wrapped the pup in a wool towel, added more logs, and sat cross-legged beside the fire. The dog's chest rose shallowly, each breath a fragile protest against the dark. Jonah leaned his back against the log wall and closed his eyes. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow and soundless. The next morning brought no sun, just light, the colorless, bleached glow of a Minnesota winter that blurred horizon from lake, tree from sky. Snow still drifted, slow and deliberate, like it was deciding whether to stay. In the cabin perched above Hallowridge Lake, silence ruled, interrupted only by the occasional snap of firewood and the steady, anxious rhythm of breath. Jonah Hale sat hunched on the floor beside the fireplace, fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug filled with water gone cold. His dark flannel shirt clung damp to his shoulders, and his knuckles were raw from the ice. But his eyes, gray and distant as the morning sky, were fixed on the creature curled just inches from the hearth. The German shepherd pup lay motionless, its body a fragile coil of black and tan fur still heavy with damp. Small tremors ran through its limbs. Its breathing, shallow, uneven, seemed to pause now and then, as if the body hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to continue. A threadbare towel half covered its flank. The fur underneath was patchy, bruised in places, and matted with what Jonah could only assume was lake muck and dried blood. The rope marks on its hind legs were deep, angry red. He leaned forward and whispered, "You made it through the night." His voice was low, not tender exactly, but firm with purpose. Jonah had always spoken like that, to kids, to victims, to ghosts, with a tone that told them they were seen, not pitted. He reached for a second towel, a thick, woolen one his father had kept hanging by the door since Jonah was a boy, and began to gently blot at the pup's fur. "No tag," he muttered. "No collar. But someone had you." The pup stirred. A faint twitch in its paw, a flicker behind closed lids. Jonah stopped drying and simply sat. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about Levi. Not directly, but somewhere in the fragile curve of ribs beneath his hand, something echoed the same ache. Loss layered on loss. He glanced up at the old stone mantel. Above it hung a black and white photo in a splintered pine frame. Two boys in winter coats, grinning, holding shovels beside a crooked snow fort. Levi at 13, tall and wild-eyed, had his arm wrapped around 9-year-old Jonah's shoulder. Between them sat Max, their wiry, half-coyote mutt with his tongue out and tail a blur. Max had died a year before Levi. Felt like the world had been unraveling ever since. Now this pup, a life thrown away like garbage, like something no one would miss. But he had fought, clawed against the ice, howled beneath the water, and somehow, impossibly, survived. Jonah leaned closer and murmured, "You're not just some stray." His fingers brushed the damp fur again, and he remembered the way the puppy's body had felt underwater, limp, cold, but not yet gone. That stubbornness, that refusal to sink, deserved a name. He searched for something that fit, something that didn't sound like pity. And then it came. "Ash?" he said aloud, letting the words settle into the quiet. Not from fire, but from what comes after. From what's left standing when the heat fades and the smoke clears. The pup didn't stir, but Jonah swore its breath steadied just slightly. Across the ridge, inside the weather-worn cabin that Loretta Quinn called home, another silence unfolded. Loretta stood in her small kitchen, stirring a tin pot of oatmeal that neither she nor her daughter had wanted to eat. She was dressed in thick leggings, an oversized green wool sweater, and the same shearling boots she'd worn for 3 winters now. Her hair was pulled into a tight knot, more practical than pretty, though a few strands framed her face like delicate lines on worn paper. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if every motion was a way to hold the world together. Her daughter, Myra, 7 years old and silent as snowfall, sat at the table playing with a pine cone and a red crayon. She drew not on paper, but on the table itself, soft swirling loops that looked like wind patterns or waves. She didn't look up. Loretta watched her for a moment before turning back to the oatmeal. Myra hadn't spoken since the accident, since the car had skidded off the ridge and rolled into the ravine. The EMTs had said she might speak again, that it was selective mutism. But Loretta didn't believe in words like that anymore. What was trauma, if not a thief who never explained itself? From the cabin window, Loretta could see the roof of the old Hale cabin across the frozen ridge. The boy Jonah was back. She remembered him vaguely. He'd grown up here, left for police training, and returned too late for his brother's funeral. She had watched him from a distance that winter, shoveling snow from the cabin roof long after the ice had melted. Grief made people do strange things. This morning, smoke curled from his chimney. Thin, gray, urgent. Loretta stepped closer to the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, lined, hollowed by years and cold. But behind it, she caught the flick of movement. A small shape, just visible in the snowdrift by the door. A dog? She frowned, then turned away. Some wounds weren't meant to be revisited. Back at Jonah's cabin, Ash stirred again. Jonah reached into the cupboard and pulled out a can of condensed soup. He poured it into a saucepan and lit the old propane stove, the flame clicking weakly before catching. The pup needed food, heat, safety. But when the kettle whistled a few minutes later, Ash bolted upright. His body went rigid, his ears flattened. Then, like a spark snapping through him, the pup scrambled backward, claws skittering on wood, and squeezed himself under the table. Jonah froze. He'd seen this reaction before, not in animals but in people, in children pulled from meth dens, in war vets jolted by fireworks. This wasn't fear. It was memory. He crouched low, let his voice go soft. "Hey, it's okay." Ash didn't move, didn't blink, just trembled. Jonah didn't reach. He just sat. Let the silence settle. Let the warmth speak instead of words. Minutes passed, then a breath, then another, and slowly, cautiously, Ash peeked out from beneath the table, his wide amber eyes searching. Jonah smiled. "We'll take it slow," he said, voice steady. "We've got time." The air in Hallowridge that morning hung motionless, as though even the wind had chosen not to disturb the brittle quiet of the pines. A weak sun pressed behind gauze-colored clouds, offering no warmth, just a suggestion that light still existed somewhere above. Frost clung to the tree branches like whispers frozen mid-breath, and a hush blanketed the forest so completely it felt sacred. Inside Jonah Hale's cabin, the fire was burning low but steady. Ash, the young German shepherd, was nestled in a tight curl on the woven rug in front of the hearth. His breathing no longer erratic, though each inhale still carried the weight of memory. His ears twitched now and then, responding to small shifts, the crack of settling wood, the hum of the kettle, the distant cry of a jay beyond the walls. He didn't flinch, not like before, but neither did he rest completely. Jonah sat at the worn oak table, flipping through an old field notebook that had once belonged to his brother Levi. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, notes on animal tracking, nature patterns, and weather signs. He wasn't reading them, not really. He just needed something to hold, something to steady the quiet. He glanced at Ash. There was something in the dog's posture, alert but withdrawn, that reminded him of the way Levi used to crouch behind the fishing shack after their father's yelling matches. Still, observant, waiting for permission to breathe again. Jonah stood, pulled on his parka, and stepped outside. The snow was thick underfoot, undisturbed except for the shallow prints of deer near the tree line. As he walked along the slope that curved toward the lake, he carried with him a coil of unease. Something about the way Ash had reacted to the sound of water, so visceral, so primal, gnawed at him. He needed to see the place again, with different eyes. The lake was still, a broad pane of matte silver stretching into the horizon. Jonah's boots left deep impressions in the crust as he retraced the path to the cracked circle of ice where he had pulled Ash free 2 mornings ago. He stopped short, just beside the ice, a place he'd barely registered in the panic of rescue. Lay the shredded remnant of a black mesh duffel bag. Half frozen beneath a drift of snow, it looked like trash left behind by careless campers. But as he crouched closer, he saw more. A twisted strand of green nylon cord, the kind used to bind gear, or legs. Jonah's throat tightened. He brushed away more snow and found a second piece of mesh, this one soaked stiff, edges frayed as though clawed from within. He looked around. The ground nearby was trampled faintly, as though someone had stood here, waited, then walked away. This wasn't just abandonment. This was intent. Ash had been meant to die here. A few hundred yards away, behind a veil of pines and snow, Loretta Quinn was standing at the easel in her cabin's narrow front room. Morning light filtered through frosted windows, casting a pearly glow over the paper stretched taut on the wooden frame. In her hand, she held a stub of charcoal, darkened at the tips of her fingers. She wasn't a trained artist. She didn't need to be. Her drawings weren't meant for galleries. They were confessions, maps, memory. Today's sketch was simple. A shoreline, broken ice, a hunched figure dragging something small from the water. She hadn't seen everything. Just enough. Just enough to know someone had risked something for something else. Behind her, Myra sat on a stool by the fire, playing with a set of polished river stones. Her hands moved with quiet grace, arranging and rearranging them by size and shape, occasionally glancing at her mother without expression. Loretta turned from her easel, wiping her hands on a wool apron. "You want to go out today?" she asked. Myra didn't nod, but she didn't shake her head either. It was progress. Back at the lake, Jonah's breath formed ragged clouds in the cold as he rose to his feet. He stared down at the evidence before him. The torn bag, the cord, the dent in the snow where a life had almost ended. His fingers curled into fists inside his gloves. Someone had done this deliberately. He took photos with his phone, recorded the GPS coordinates, and marked the area with a small stack of broken branches before heading back up the trail. Inside the cabin, Ash was no longer asleep. As Jonah opened the door, the pup was standing just beyond the fire, head lifted, ears perked toward the sound of boots crunching outside. When he saw Jonah, his posture shifted, not fear but focus. Jonah knelt and held out a hand. It's okay, buddy. I just went to check on something. Ash didn't move immediately, but after a few long seconds, he stepped forward and pressed his nose briefly to Jonah's palm. It was the first time he'd made contact without flinching. You're not just healing, Jonah murmured. You're watching. That night, Jonah filled a second bowl, this time with soft chicken broth and bits of boiled potato. He placed it down beside Ash with no sudden motion. The pup sniffed, hesitated, then began to eat, slow and careful. Jonah watched him the entire time, not with pity, but reverence. He didn't know what kind of man could tie up a creature like this and leave him for dead, but he was starting to understand what kind of survivor Ash was, and what that meant for both of them. The next morning, as snow began to fall again in light, aimless flakes, Jonah visited the Cold Haven station for the first time since taking extended leave. Captain Miriam Rourke sat behind her desk in a gray flannel shirt and a stiff khaki vest. She was in her late 40s, built like a tree stump, short, sturdy, with a face carved from experience and windburn. Her dark hair was streaked with white and cut close to her scalp, and she wore reading glasses on a chain like a reluctant librarian. "What brings you in, Hale?" she asked, not unkindly. "You've been a ghost. I need to file a report. Something I found up by the lake." She nodded for him to sit. As Jonah recounted the rescue, the duffel bag, and the evidence of foul play, Rourke's expression didn't shift, but her fingers, tapping against the desk, slowed. "This sounds like more than just someone tossing a pet," she said after a pause. "You think this dog was part of something? Organized? I don't know, but whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." Rourke reached for a yellow folder and slid it toward him. "We've had 2 similar calls in the past month. One in Moose Hollow, one in Renville. Both dumped dogs. One dead, one missing." Jonah's stomach turned. "You think they're connected?" "I think you need to watch your back," she replied, "and keep that dog close." That night, Jonah lay on the cot with the fire low and Ash curled near his boots. Outside, the trees whispered in their icy language, but inside the cabin felt warmer, not just in temperature but in weight, in presence. Ash lifted his head once before sleep, scanned the room and let it fall again, this time without fear. The snowfall had thinned by morning, but the cold had deepened, sinking into the bones of Hallowridge like a second silence. The sky, a pale wash of ash and pearl, hung low above the pines, and the lake below Jonah's cabin had frozen again. This time smoother, crueler, like a pane of untouched glass waiting to be broken. Inside, Ash stirred restlessly near the hearth, his ears twitching with every creak of the old log walls. Jonah knelt beside him, a folded wool blanket in his arms. The pup was gaining strength, his coat shinier now, his ribs less visible. But trust remained delicate, a thread easily snapped. Still, he had begun to shadow Jonah's movements. Where Jonah stood, Ash sat. Where Jonah waited, Ash watched. Not like a dog looking for orders, but like a sentinel deciding if the world was safe again. Jonah pulled on his coat, zipped it to the collar, and rested a hand on the pup's head. "You ready?" Ash didn't move. Jonah smiled slightly. "Didn't think so." He stepped out into the morning alone. The lead Jonah had gotten from Captain Rourke sat heavy in his pocket. The report from Moose Hollow. A similar bag, same kind of cord. The dog found barely alive. A partial match to an old, rusted animal transport van seen driving west on Highway 9. But no plate. It wasn't much. But it was enough. That trail led west, into the woods behind Hallowridge, toward a stretch of land that had long been abandoned. The forest grew denser out there. Fewer cabins. Less oversight. A perfect place for someone who wanted to stay hidden. Jonah moved quietly, boots crunching over crusted snow. The trees closed in as he walked. Tall black spruce and fir, their shadows cold and angular. He knew this land. Levi and he had explored it as boys, but even memory seemed distant here now. It was Ash who found the path first. Jonah had returned briefly to the cabin to retrieve a flashlight. When he opened the door, Ash was waiting, alert, eyes bright. "You want to come?" Ash stepped forward, slow but certain. They moved together along the ridge, Ash weaving just ahead, nose low, tail stiff with attention. When they passed an old trail marker long overtaken by moss and snow, the dog paused. He sniffed the base of a tree, circled, then headed left, deeper into the thicket. Jonah followed. At the same time, Loretta Quinn stood in her workshop, staring at a drawing she hadn't meant to finish. It was a portrait of a dog. Not from imagination but from memory. The same black and tan shepherd she'd seen through the trees 3 days ago. But in her sketch, his eyes weren't wide with fear. They were sharp, focused, as if he had seen something the world hadn't. Behind her, Myra was humming, quietly, barely a note, but it was sound. Loretta didn't react. She simply turned and knelt, gently placing a small clay fox into her daughter's hands. "Do you like it?" Myra nodded. The silence, once constant, now flickered. Loretta rose, pulled on her coat, and glanced toward the window. Snow still drifted through the branches, but the world outside no longer felt quite so far away. She didn't know why, but something in her gut told her Jonah was looking for more than answers, and something darker than snow was waiting to be found. Jonah and Ash moved through the forest until the trees opened to a clearing. A sagging wooden shack tucked behind a curtain of brush. It wasn't visible from any trail, and only someone searching would have found it. Ash stopped, body rigid, nose pointing toward the structure. His fur bristled. Jonah lowered himself behind a fallen log, watching. The shack's back door was half open. Wind fluttered a tarp hanging inside. A rusted cage leaned against the wall, partially covered by a tattered blanket. The ground around it was disturbed. Footprints, tire tracks, and something more sinister. Scattered bits of fur and broken zip ties. Ash growled low but didn't bark. Jonah crept forward, gun holstered but hand ready. He circled to the far side of the building, stepping lightly. There, near a cluster of stacked crates, he found what he hadn't wanted to see. A sedative dart, capped in blood, lying frozen in the snow. He snapped a photo and crouched lower. Ash stood beside him, unmoving, his body a tight coil of muscle. Then they heard it. Footsteps. From the trees beyond the shack, a figure emerged. A man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn army jacket and a knit cap pulled low. He moved like someone who didn't expect company. As he approached the shack, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a ring of keys. Ash let out a sharp bark. The man froze. Jonah stepped out from cover. "Police! Don't move!" The man bolted. But Ash didn't wait. The pup tore after him with surprising speed, bounding through snowdrifts like a shadow. Jonah followed, heart pounding. Through brush and over fallen limbs, Ash weaved with uncanny precision, closing the gap until finally, he lunged, bringing the man crashing into the snow with a heavy grunt. Jonah arrived seconds later, cuffing the suspect as Ash stood over him, chest heaving but unafraid. "Derek Vance," Jonah muttered, recognizing the name from the Moose Hollow file. "Guess we know where the others went." That night, back at the cabin, Ash lay curled near the fire again, this time by choice. He no longer shivered when the kettle hissed or the wind howled. He watched Jonah with calm eyes. Jonah fed him from his hand. Then, instead of returning to the cot, he lay on the rug beside the pup. Ash shifted once, pressed his back against Jonah's chest, and let out a long breath, half sigh, half surrender. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows. But inside, something warmer stirred. A bond. Pact. Not one of ownership, but of survival. By the time dawn stretched pale fingers across the trees, the snow had softened, giving the woods a sheen of fragile peace. But beneath the sloped boughs of fir and pine, where light barely reached and ice still clung to branches like brittle lace, the quiet was misleading. Hallow Ridge was thawing, yes, but not everything melting was snow. Jonah Hale stood outside the cabin with one hand on his belt and the other cradling a steaming mug of weak coffee. The rising sun did little against the cold, but it was enough to give the treetops a gilded edge. Behind him, inside the cabin, Ash was curled against the far wall, half dozing, one eye slightly open. He no longer flinched at every creak. But he hadn't wagged his tail yet, not once. Jonah took a slow sip and exhaled into the cold. The arrest of Derek Vance had stirred more questions than answers. The man had refused to speak during the overnight holding. Not about the mesh bags, not about the syringes, not about the zip ties soaked with dog fur. But Captain Rourke had confirmed it. Derek had priors in 3 counties for unlicensed animal trade, and his fingerprints matched those found on the duffel at Hallow Ridge Lake. Jonah had seen predators before, human ones, but this was different. There was no rage in Derek's actions, no chaos, just design. He stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind him. Ash blinked and raised his head. There was something new in his posture, a slow ease, a quiet trust. He watched Jonah walk across the room and reached his muzzle forward, pressing it gently to Jonah's hand. A small act, but it felt like a mile. "You're doing better," Jonah whispered. "I see it." Ash's tail flicked once. Not a wag, but close. Across the ridge, Loretta Quinn was brushing snow from her porch steps when the knock came. She turned, heart suddenly quickened, to find Jonah standing in a charcoal gray flannel, coat half-zipped, boots dusted white. His eyes were soft but hesitant, the kind of look worn by men who never assumed they were welcome. He held a folder under one arm. "Morning," he said. Loretta nodded, not inviting him in, but not turning away. "I wanted to ask if you've seen anything off in the woods. People, vehicles, animals maybe." Loretta hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. Her gaze flicked down to the folder, then to Jonah's face. "I saw someone near the lake a few days back. Didn't recognize him." "Near the time of the rescue?" She nodded again. "Before the snow picked up." Jonah's fingers tightened slightly on the folder. "That helps. Thank you." Then, after a moment's pause, Loretta stepped aside and opened the door. Jonah didn't move. "You want to come in?" she asked. Only then did he step forward. The cabin smelled of pine and iron kettles. A fire burned in the hearth. On the shelf above it were small clay animals, owls, foxes, bears, all made by Loretta's hands. They were delicate, precise, as if shaped from memory instead of earth. Myra was sitting cross-legged on a wool rug, hands gently tapping a wooden toy against her knee. Her hair was chestnut dark like her mother's, and her eyes wide with a cautious calm. She didn't look up when Jonah entered but tilted her head slightly, registering the shift in air. "She's quiet," Loretta said, noticing Jonah's glance. Jonah nodded. "So's Ash." A long silence followed. Loretta moved to the stove and poured a cup of tea, set it on the table. "You're not just checking on the lake, are you?" "No," Jonah admitted. "There've been other cases. 2 at least. I think it's connected. I think Derek's part of something bigger." He had supply routes mapped in a notebook. Places where strays are common, or where people don't ask questions. Loretta's hand paused midair. "Out here we don't have a shelter," she said quietly. "I know. Myra and I take in strays sometimes, mostly birds or cats. But we hear things." Jonah looked up. "2 nights ago," Loretta continued, "there was a truck. I didn't see it, but Myra heard it. She tapped the window twice. That's how she tells me it's not an animal." Jonah glanced at the child. "She sees more than she lets on." Loretta nodded. She always did. Later that afternoon, Jonah returned to his cabin with a satchel full of hand-drawn maps, Rourke's data, and the suspicion that the clearing behind the ridge wasn't the last place Derek had used. Ash followed him from room to room, ears twitching, posture alert. At one point, Jonah stopped at the window and watched as Ash padded to the door, nose lifted to the wind. He was still listening, still remembering. That evening, the storm returned. It came without warning. A sharp wind from the northwest, dragging snow like ash across the trees. The cabin groaned beneath it, and for a moment, Jonah felt the strange tightness of dread coil in his chest. The same dread he had known the night Levi died. Ash was pacing now, not frantically but with purpose. He circled the door, then paused, staring at Jonah. "You hear something?" Jonah asked softly. Ash pressed his paw to the bottom crack of the door. Jonah opened it. And there, standing in the swirling white, were Loretta and Myra. The girl's cheeks were red with cold, her coat too thin for the wind. She clutched a sketchbook in her mittened hands. Loretta's hair was wind-blown, her expression unreadable. "I think they're coming back," she said. Jonah stepped aside. "Come in." That night Ash didn't sleep. Neither did Jonah. They watched the storm roll against the windows, and for once, they weren't alone in it. The storm raged through the night like something ancient. Trees groaned under the weight of wind and snow, and gusts screamed between the pines, lashing against the eaves of Jonah's cabin. But inside, the silence was warm, tightly woven between firelight, wool blankets, and the fragile sense that, for now, they were safe. Ash lay curled in the center of the room, his dark amber eyes locked on the door. He hadn't moved in an hour, but his ears twitched with every rise of the wind. Jonah sat across from him, legs stretched, a notepad on his lap. Loretta and Myra were huddled on the cot nearby, wrapped in quilts Loretta herself had once sewn from scraps of old flannel shirts. The storm had turned strangers into something closer, fellow witnesses, fellow survivors. Jonah looked up from his notes. She slept. Loretta nodded. Her chestnut hair was loose now, falling over her shoulder in a tired braid. "Eventually. She's stronger than she looks," Jonah said, voice quiet. "She always was," Loretta replied, with a ghost of a smile. Jonah turned back to the pad, studying the notes he'd copied from Derek Vance's file, partial delivery routes, odd initials, sketches of terrain. One line had stood out all evening: "Back trail post. Move crate before melt." He knew that trail. So did Ash. By dawn, the wind began to fade, and the sky above Hallow Ridge lightened to the color of bone. The storm had dumped nearly 2 feet of snow, heavy, wet, and perfect for burying secrets. But secrets, Jonah knew, had a way of surfacing. Ash was the first to rise. He padded toward the back window, nose pressed against the glass. A low whine escaped his throat. Jonah followed his gaze. Tracks, fresh, leading away from the tree line. Not tire marks, boot prints. Deep and deliberate. "They were here," Jonah said, breath-catching. Loretta rose from the cot. "Did they see us?" "I don't think so, but they're moving, and they're close." Within an hour, Jonah had strapped on his gear, snowshoes, thermals, a sidearm, and packed enough supplies for 2 days. Loretta, without a word, handed him a satchel of dried fruit and jerky she'd stored for emergencies. "You shouldn't go alone," she said. "I'm not." Ash stood beside him, already alert. They followed the trail through the trees where the storm had carved deep trenches. Ash led, nose to the ground, navigating the ridges with uncanny precision. The boot prints veered south, past old hunter blinds and crumbling fence lines, toward a long-forgotten access road that once led to a ranger outpost. Now, it was used by no one except poachers and ghosts. As they crested a ridge, the forest broke open. Below, barely visible through the trees, sat a rusted trailer. The rear door hung slightly ajar. 2 barrels flanked the side wall, and a black tarp was pulled tight across something long and still. Ash growled low. Jonah crouched, hand resting on the pup's shoulder. They waited, watching. No movement. Minutes passed. Then a rustle. A shape moved within the trailer. Jonah stood and advanced, boots crunching over the hardened crust. Ash stayed at his side, body taut. Inside, the air reeked of iron and wet fur. Wooden crates stacked too high. Plastic buckets with kibble residue. Chains on hooks. And in the corner, barely breathing, 2 dogs huddled against the wall. One brindled, the other pale with swollen joints. Jonah's breath caught. He moved fast, checking the animal's conditions, pulling wire cutters from his belt. Then a voice. "Turn around." Slowly, Jonah froze. A man stood behind him, thin, maybe in his 50s, with hollow cheeks and a thick parka smeared in mud. He held a hunting rifle, shaking slightly, more from age than conviction. "This ain't your business," the man growled. Ash took a single step forward, teeth bared. Jonah raised one hand, slowly. "They're not just animals," he said. "They're survivors. Just like him." He pointed at Ash. The old man faltered. Then Ash did something Jonah didn't expect. He didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He stepped forward and sat, calm, watching. The man's grip loosened. The rifle dropped an inch. Jonah seized the moment. He lunged, knocking the weapon aside, and Ash leapt, pinning the man to the trailer floor. They cuffed him with zip ties, called it in. Captain Rourke arrived 40 minutes later with officers Blake and Tanya Joe, who loaded the animals gently into transport carriers and sealed the trailer for evidence. Rourke stood beside Jonah, her lined face unreadable. Derek talked, said this guy Earl Stratton was the supplier. Found dogs in small towns. Discarded. Easy prey. Jonah glanced at Ash, who was drinking from a bowl near the truck's rear tire. "Not anymore," he said. Days passed. Spring's edge touched Hallow Ridge in tiny gestures. Melted ice along the lake's edges, sap rising in the birch trees, birds returning like rumors. The snow didn't vanish, but it softened. Ash began to wag his tail. Not often, but enough. Jonah built a small shelter outside the cabin, just beyond the porch. For sturdy posts, a sloped roof, open to the woods. Ash sat beneath it in the evenings, ears perked, eyes on the horizon. He never strayed far. But Jonah knew he could if he wanted to. That mattered. Loretta and Myra came often now. The girl had begun speaking again. Not full sentences, not yet, but soft words shaped in breath and syllable. Her first was Ash. Jonah had looked at Loretta, heart catching in his throat. Loretta only smiled. Told you she sees more than she lets on. They shared dinner by the hearth that night, for souls joined not by blood or duty, but by healing. And when Ash lay down near the door, not as a guard, but as a guest in the place he'd chosen, Jonah finally understood what Levi had meant all those years ago, when he whispered that love wasn't a place or a promise. It was presence, and Ash had brought him back to it. Sometimes the smallest spark, like a trembling pup left to die, can reignite the warmth in a heart frozen by grief. In a world so often clouded by cruelty, we are reminded that God's miracles don't always come as thunder or light. They come quietly, through love, through second chances, through the healing only compassion can bring. Ash wasn't just rescued, he became the rescuer. And Jonah wasn't just a protector, he was restored by the very life he saved. Maybe that's how God works. Through the broken, the abandoned, the ones the world forgets. So today, if you're feeling lost, tired, or alone, remember, he sees you, and he's not done writing your story yet. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment amen if you believe in second chances. And don't forget to subscribe so more souls can hear these quiet miracles. May God bless you and keep you always.
A little girl and her dog, frozen together beneath the weight of a merciless snowstorm. No movement, no sound, just two fragile bodies curled beneath a dying sky, waiting for a miracle that never came. Until he found them. A young American officer, not trained for this kind of war, but led by the instincts of a canine hero by his side. One step closer, one heartbeat away from being too late. What happened next will remind you that not all heroes wear capes, some wear collars, and some carry badges. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story of survival and loyalty can travel. And if you believe no child, no dog, no soul should ever be left alone in the cold, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear will melt even the frostiest heart. The sky above Coldridge, Montana, hung like a leaden curtain that night, thick, heavy, and deaf to prayers. The wind screamed through the pine barrens and vacant streets, slamming against shuttered windows and layering the land in ghost-white silence. It was past midnight, and the storm had shown no mercy. Snow danced sideways under the amber glow of flickering streetlights. No one sane would have been outside in this. No one but Officer Ethan Moore and his canine partner, Ranger. Ethan's boots sank with each step into the crusted snow along a narrow maintenance road that twisted past the town's northern edge. The patrol car had been left parked half a mile behind, its tires chained, engine humming, on low idle in case they needed to retreat. Ethan wasn't big on small talk, even with himself. His breath steamed out in short, controlled bursts, and his dark brown eyes scanned the white horizon with trained precision. He stood just over 6 feet tall, wiry but capable, with sun-worn skin and high cheekbones that made him look sterner than he meant to. He had the stance of someone always braced for impact, part discipline, part experience, and part heartbreak. 5 years ago, his kid sister disappeared in a whiteout blizzard not far from here. They'd never found her. He still kept her silver locket in the inside pocket of his duty coat, a heart-shaped charm with a dent along the edge, an old souvenir from an arcade claw machine, and a final failed birthday gift. Ranger trotted by his side, nose low to the snow, shoulders shifting in fluid grace. 3 years old, sharp as a whip, his coat was a mix of rust and deep black, with a faint silver streak along the spine. A streak earned from a healed scar when he saved a hiker from a mountain lion last spring. Ranger had a scar under his left eye, too, almost invisible in the dark, but it gave him a permanent look of quiet judgment. He didn't bark without cause, didn't bolt without command. A partner like no other. Ethan had learned to trust Ranger's instincts more than any compass. Tonight was routine check the outskirts after the storm alert. Make sure no vehicles had gone off-road, no drifters trapped in the forested gullies. But Ethan hated the quiet that snowstorms brought. Too clean, too soft, the kind of quiet that could bury screams without a trace. Ranger stopped. No sound preceded it, no obvious sign. 1 second they were walking, the next, the dog froze mid-stride, ears pricked, body tense. His right paw hovered above the snow, unmoving. Ethan felt it too, that ripple of dread crawling up his spine. "What is it?" he asked under his breath. Ranger didn't respond with sound. He simply took 3 cautious steps forward, nose twitching into the wind. Then he turned his head, looked at Ethan with eyes sharp as glass, and moved again slow and low toward the left, away from the path, into deeper snow. Ethan followed, heart rate ticking up, hand resting over the flashlight clipped to his belt. He scanned the area ahead. Visibility was minimal, but the beam cut through enough to paint outlines. Snow swirled, pines loomed like sleeping giants. Then, near the tree line, a dark patch broke the smooth white. At first, it looked like a pile of branches, but as Ethan moved closer, details sharpened. The outline was all wrong for wood. It was curled small, a bundle of limbs and cloth and... no, not cloth, hair, a little girl. Ethan's body responded before his mind finished the sentence. He moved faster now, each stride punching into the snow. Ranger beat him to it, skidding to a halt inches from the figure, nose dipping low. She was lying on her side, curled into herself. Her jacket, pink and thin, was crusted with frost. 1 boot missing. Her arms wrapped tightly around something pressed against her chest. Ethan's breath caught as he realized what it was. A dog. Tiny, maybe 8 pounds at most. A terrier or mutt mix, covered in ice and dirt. Unmoving, but tucked into her as if it had crawled there to protect her with its last ounce of warmth. Its head rested beneath her chin, almost like a pillow. Neither of them stirred. "Dear God," Ethan whispered. He dropped to his knees just as the wind gusted again, throwing snow against his back like sandpaper. His gloved fingers hovered for a moment above the child's shoulder, afraid to touch, afraid she'd crumble under his hand. Ranger stood beside him now, silent, posture still tense. The flashlight beam wavered slightly in Ethan's grip as he leaned closer, eyes darting between the girl's face and the dog she held like a lifeline. Her lips were pale blue. There was no visible bleeding, no sign of trauma, just a terrifying stillness. Her hair, long and dark, was frozen in strands against her face, lashes white with frost. She looked about 9 years old, and she wasn't alone. That dog, despite its tiny frame, despite the cold, had stayed, had held on, and now they were here. The first thing Ethan noticed, once the wind calmed just long enough for him to really see, was her eyelashes, thick with frost. Unmoving, but unmistakably human. He reached down, brushing snow away from her face with his gloved hand, revealing a young girl's delicate features, pale from cold. She looked about 9, maybe 10, her cheeks sunken, lips parted just slightly, as if mid-whisper. Her breath, if there at all, came in shallow pulses. Yet what stopped him from tipping into panic was not her face, but the strange way she clutched something close to her chest, something alive. A small dog. A terrier mix, no more than 10 pounds. Its fur soaked and frozen at the tips. Patches of white and tan peeked through the frost, and its eyes, half-lidded, cloudy lifted toward Ethan just long enough to register his presence. It gave a faint, high-pitched whine, then burrowed deeper into the girl's jacket, trembling. Still alive. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Then came Ranger, who stepped forward without hesitation and lowered his body beside them. The German Shepherd pressed close, flank to flank with the tiny dog, forming a barrier of heat. His breath fogged against the girl's temple as he sniffed once, then lay his head near her ear, still and steady. "You're doing good, buddy," Ethan murmured, voice catching. "Hold them both. I've got the rest." Without delay, Ethan unfastened the thermal emergency blanket from his kit and wrapped it around the girl and her dog. He worked quickly, delicately, as if wrapping porcelain. She didn't react, no stirring, no blinking. But her arms were still curled around the little dog with unconscious purpose. He checked for signs of injury, no blood, no fractures, but her skin was like ice to the touch. Ethan gathered her in his arms. Her weight was almost nothing. Her name was still a mystery, her story even more so. The dog made a soft sound as it was lifted with her, pressed against her chest. Ethan wrapped both in his duty coat before standing and turning toward Ranger. "Come." Ranger rose instantly, snow clinging to his legs and belly. He moved ahead through the path they'd made earlier, retracing their way back to the patrol car. The wind picked up again as they moved, slicing through the air like glass. Ethan held the child tightly against his body, his fingers tightening unconsciously when she shuddered slightly, barely perceptible. But it was movement, a sign she was still fighting. Each step felt heavier, not just because of the deep snow, but because something had shifted in him. The image of the girl curled beside her tiny protector echoed too perfectly with a memory he'd tried for years to bury. The last day of his canine training, 5 years ago. The day everything almost ended. Back then, Ethan had been assigned to an older shepherd named Duke. A veteran dog with tired eyes and half a tail, Duke had saved 3 hikers from an avalanche 2 winters prior. During a drill on the slopes, Ethan slipped on an iced-over ridge and fell. His wrist shattered, shoulder dislocated, radio lost. Cold settled fast, panic faster, but Duke didn't leave. He'd crawled over Ethan, tail wrapped around the boy's chest like a belt, his nose nudging him every few minutes. The team didn't find them until hours later. Ethan came out of it with scars, physical and otherwise. He almost quit the program. Almost. Ranger came after. A stray rescue, selected for his intelligence and fierce loyalty, but nearly deemed too reactive for patrol work. Ethan had insisted, trained him slow, with patience. They built something that couldn't be logged in a report or recorded on video. A bond etched into instinct. Now, years later, here they were. Ethan carrying a child on the edge of death, and Ranger warming a stranger with the same calm he once gave his handler. The patrol car came into view, buried halfway under snowfall. Steam rose from its exhaust, muffled by the storm. Ethan pulled open the back door, gently laying the girl and her dog across the back seat, wrapping them again in the blanket. Ranger jumped in beside them without command and curled close, pressing his large body against them like a furnace. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and started speaking into the dispatch radio, dead silence. The antenna must have iced over. Cell signal non-existent out here. Damn it! He slammed his palm against the steering wheel, then turned back to look. The little dog's eyes had closed, but it was breathing, shallow and fast. The girl hadn't moved, but her fingers had relaxed slightly around her dog's fur. That was enough. He shifted into gear, tires crunching slowly out of the snowbank, headlights cutting a path through the swirling white. The engine groaned against the cold as Ethan pressed deeper into the storm. The defroster struggled against ice building up on the inside of the windshield, and the wipers screeched with every pass. He kept one hand tight on the wheel and the other braced near the heater vents, just inches from the little girl huddled in the back seat. Her breath was still faint, visible only in the smallest of fogged exhales. Wrapped in 2 layers of thermal blankets, she remained unconscious, her small body curled protectively around the trembling terrier in her arms. Benny. That name hadn't been spoken aloud yet, but Ethan had found it, stitched in uneven, hand-sewn letters onto a scrap of faded flannel poking out of her canvas backpack. Maddie and Benny, forever side by side. The thread was pink and frayed in places. like it had been sewn by a child's hand or a loving parent late at night. Ethan turned that piece of fabric over in his mind more than once as the road curved through the white void. Whoever this girl was, whoever made that stitch, someone had loved her very much, and she had loved Benny enough to protect him even as she lost consciousness. Ranger remained in the back with them. The large German shepherd had wedged himself between the seat and the child, his head resting on her hip, his body curved protectively around hers and the little dog. Every so often he would lift his head, check the girl's face, then lower it again as if confirming they were still alive. "Keep her warm," Ethan whispered, without turning his head. "You're doing good." He reached for the radio again. The signal had been dead on approach, and for a time the only thing the speaker produced was static. He adjusted the frequency, angled the antenna control near the windshield. Nothing. His jaw clenched as he swerved past a snow-covered mailbox. Then finally, faint, crackled, he heard something. "Say again. Identify." Ethan grabbed the handset. "Unit 24, Officer Moore, Coldridge Patrol. I've got a child female, unknown age, possibly hypothermic. Also one canine non-aggressive, smaller breed both, alive but unresponsive. Requesting emergency response, over." There was a pause, more static, then a different voice answered. A woman's, older, composed, but strained. "Unit 24, this is Coldridge General. Say your location and ETA. The storm has taken out half our grid. We've got limited staff, but we're prepping ER now. 5 miles out, approaching West Slope Turnpike. I'm coming in hot," Ethan said, one hand tightening on the wheel as his foot pressed the gas a little harder. "Copy. Drive safe, officer. We've got you." The voice belonged to Dr. Grace Holloway, who had taken over the emergency wing of Coldridge General just 2 years earlier. In her late 40s, with streaks of gray in her braided black hair, Grace was a no-nonsense kind of woman, tall, broad-shouldered, with the stride of someone who had once run marathons and the glare of someone who had once raised teenage sons alone. She didn't care for bureaucracy, didn't use titles, and never forgot a face. When her youngest son died in a flood while she was stuck in surgery during her residency, something hardened in her, but it made her sharper, not cruel. In Coldridge, people knew if you ended up in the ER and Grace was there, your odds just got better. Inside the car, Ethan exhaled slowly, eyes darting between the frost-coated road and the rearview mirror. "Hang in there, kid," he murmured. Another gust slammed into the side of the vehicle. Snow tore across the glass like claws. The road curved right, then dipped. Visibility dropped. He flipped on the high beams and leaned forward instinctively, as though it would help him see more. The heater was running full blast now, but the car still felt like the inside of a walk-in freezer. The blankets had started to thaw the frost from the girl's hair, leaving small beads of water along her cheekbones. Benny stirred, just barely. His head moved, ears twitching once, then stillness again. Ethan glanced again at the note inside her backpack. Next to the stitched cloth had been a child's drawing. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, and a dog in between. The smaller figure had a pink triangle dress, and above her was scrawled, "Me and Benny, Daddy's watching from the sky." That line hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know this girl's name yet, not officially, but something in his gut whispered Maddie. It wasn't just the fabric or the drawing. It was the way her arms wouldn't unclench from around that dog, even in near death. The way Ranger had pressed close like she was already part of the team. He blinked hard, pressed on. The road cleared briefly, shielded by a row of tall pines. On his left, snowdrifts rose into jagged white hills. On his right, the slope dropped sharply. Somewhere beyond that was the river, half frozen and deadly this time of year. He kept the car steady, one hand now gripping the wheel with white knuckles. Behind him, Ranger let out a soft chuff. Ethan didn't need to look, he knew. The girl had stirred. "She moved?" he asked aloud, half turning. Ranger responded with another low chuff, then licked the side of her head gently. Ethan let out a shaky breath. "We're gonna make it. We're gonna get you there." He turned back to the windshield, just as the final curve straightened out. In the distance, through the flurries and haze, the blinking orange lights of Coldridge General Hospital broke through the whiteness like a lighthouse on the edge of a frozen sea. The automatic doors at Coldridge General Hospital whooshed open with a reluctant groan as Ethan burst through them, his arms cradling the lifeless weight of the little girl. Snow blew in behind him, trailing over the gray tile floors like a ghost unwilling to let go. Inside, the air was warm but tense, filled with the low buzz of fluorescent lights and the clipped footsteps of night staff moving fast. "Emergency intake, 9 or 10 years old, hypothermia," Ethan's voice echoed across the near-empty lobby. Within seconds, Dr. Grace Holloway appeared, flanked by a younger nurse and a male orderly. Grace moved quickly, tall, powerful in her stride, and completely composed, her jaw clenched as her eyes swept over the child in Ethan's arms. Vitals? Unconscious, breathing shallow, body cold to the core. "I estimate her body temp around 25 Celsius, maybe lower," Ethan said, still walking. Ranger paced beside him, silent and alert. "Let's get her on the table. Room 2. Warm IVs, thermal wraps, and contact NICU support. Now," Grace commanded. The orderly, Jared, a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with freckled skin and soft blue eyes, nodded and took the lead, guiding Ethan into a side corridor. The girl Maddie, as Ethan had come to call her silently, was transferred to a gurney by the team with swift precision. Her arms were still curled around Benny, who had not uttered a sound since the car ride. The little terrier's body was limp but breathing. As they wheeled Maddie away, another figure appeared in the hallway. She was in her early 50s, short and slim, with graying blonde hair tucked into a low bun and a knitted lavender cardigan draped over her scrubs. This was Olivia Kearns, the hospital's head nurse. Olivia was known in town for being soft-spoken but unshakable, a woman whose calm could hold steady even when others broke. Her eyes were kind but lined with fatigue born from years of night shifts and hard losses. Olivia looked at the bundle in Ethan's arms, the tiny dog he still cradled carefully in the other blanket, and extended her hands gently. "I'll take him. We have a vet technician on call for emergencies. They're prepping now." Ethan hesitated a second, then passed Benny into her arms. The little dog stirred, his head lifting weakly. Olivia smiled. "Hang in there, sweetheart," she whispered. "Will he make it?" Ethan asked, voice quieter now. "If he's survived this long," Olivia said, turning toward the elevator, "he's got more fight in him than most." Ethan leaned against the wall, finally letting his back hit the cold plaster, heart still thudding. Ranger sat beside him, his tail barely twitching. The hallway buzzed with motion nurses calling codes, footsteps echoing, the faint beep of vital monitors somewhere behind closed doors. Then Olivia returned, minus Benny, and without saying anything, sat next to him on the wooden bench. She didn't speak for a few moments, letting the quiet settle between them like a blanket. "I lost my daughter in a house fire," she said finally. Ethan turned his head slightly. "She was 6. I wasn't home. Gas leak sparked while she was playing with crayons in the living room. I thought..." Her voice cracked once, then returned, steady as stone. "I thought there was no chance, but when the firefighters pulled her out, she was curled in the hallway, and our cat, Muffin, had been lying on her chest, covered in soot, burned on her back, but alive." Ethan's eyes softened. "She lived. I mean, we lost the house, and Muffin never walked to you the same again. But my daughter, she lived." Olivia gave a small smile, one that trembled at the corners. "That cat didn't weigh more than 8 pounds, but she shielded a child with everything she had, and you'd be surprised what a little warmth can do." Ethan stared down at Ranger. "Animals know more than we give them credit for." "They do," Olivia said. "That big boy of yours, he knew what he was doing. He gave that girl a chance." Just then, Dr. Grace reappeared from around the corner, tugging off a pair of latex gloves. Her face betrayed nothing, but her voice carried weight. "She's stable for now. Body temp is up to 28. We've started rewarming procedures, bear hugger, warm IV fluids, warmed oxygen. She's still unresponsive, but her vitals are trending in the right direction." Ethan exhaled, shoulders sagging. "There's a long road ahead," Grace added, crossing her arms. "But you got her here in time. Minutes later, we might be having a different conversation." "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice raspy. "You did your part," Grace replied. "Now, let us do ours." Olivia stood and nodded toward the other end of the hall. "Let me get you some coffee." "I'm good," Ethan murmured. "You're not," she said with a knowing smile. "But you will be." As Olivia disappeared around the corner, Ethan stood up slowly and walked to the window at the far end of the hall. The storm was still raging outside. Snow plastered the glass, swirling in wild arcs, but inside the hospital it was still, warm. Ranger stood next to him, his eyes watching the closed ER doors where Maddie was being treated. The German shepherd let out a soft breath, and Ethan reached down to rest a hand between his ears. "You did good, partner," he whispered. The address on the worn student ID card was handwritten in blue ink, slightly smudged, tucked in a plastic sleeve inside the girl's small canvas backpack. Ethan stared at it for a moment beneath the soft yellow light of the hospital's front entrance. He repeated it in his mind, committed it to memory. He didn't need to search maps. He knew that road. A dead-end street at the northern edge of Coldridge, near the woods. Quiet, isolated, a few weathered cabins that looked more like they belonged in the pages of a snowbound novel than a modern town. Ranger walked close by his side, his ears forward, gaze steady. The storm had eased just slightly, reduced now to flurries, but the sky still hung low and heavy. Ethan's tires crunched on the packed snow as he guided the cruiser down a narrow lane that twisted between tall pine trees. Each house they passed was dark or half-lit, porches buried in drifts. Then he saw it. A small log house, barely 2 stories high, with warm light spilling through thin curtains in one front window. There were no tire tracks in the driveway, only footprints leading from the door to the road and back again, many, frantic, pacing. Ethan parked and stepped out. Ranger remained at his side. As they approached the porch, he saw movement through the window. A figure small-framed, with wild hair pulled into a loose bun standing near the window, clutching a phone. She hadn't seen them yet. He knocked. Footsteps, the creak of floorboards. Then the door opened just a few inches, guarded by a rusted chain. The woman behind the door had the look of someone who hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red and swollen, her skin pale with that yellow hue that stress brings. Wisps of hair had fallen from her bun, clinging to her cheeks. Her voice, when it came, cracked under the weight of hope and fear. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said gently, holding his badge up. "Are you Lily Johnson?" Her breath hitched. "Yes. I think I found your daughter." The chain rattled. The door opened wider. Lily's hands shot to her mouth as her knees buckled. She stumbled back a step, gripping the edge of the doorway to stay upright. "Maddie?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She's alive?" "She is. She's stable at Coldridge General. She was found during the patrol. The dog with her, Benny, is alive too. They stayed together." Lily let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh before her body folded in on itself. She sank down onto the edge of the porch in her slippers, shaking violently as tears poured freely down her cheeks. Her fingers clutched her robe at the chest, as if to hold her heart from breaking all over again. "I thought she was dead," she whispered, rocking slightly. "Oh God, I thought I lost her." Ethan knelt down in front of her, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You didn't. She's going to need time, but she's here. And she kept Benny warm. She fought." Lily wiped her face, but the tears kept coming. After a moment, she stood shakily and ushered Ethan inside with a quiet, breathless, "Please." The house smelled like cinnamon and burnt toast. A small living room opened into a kitchen with chipped countertops and warm light glowing under old oak cabinets. A plate of uneaten spaghetti sat on the table, congealed and cold. On the counter, 2 mugs, one still steaming, slightly stood untouched. In the living room, a pink scarf lay balled on the sofa, next to a small fleece jacket that still held the imprint of a child's body. A crayon drawing was pinned with a magnet to the fridge, a girl holding hands with a small dog, both smiling under a rainbow. Above the drawing was written, "Maddie plus Benny equals best friends forever." Ethan took it all in silently. "I made dinner, but she never came back," Lily said, her voice distant now as she stood by the sink. "School closed early. She usually takes the shortcut behind the ridge. The storm came fast. I thought she'd gotten caught somewhere, maybe waited it out at a friend's, but no one had seen her. Her phone must have died. I walked the roads, yelled into the woods. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The police said the storm made search impossible." Her hands clutched the sink's edge, white-knuckled. "I thought I'd find her frozen, or not at all." Ethan stepped closer. She was curled up in the snow, holding Benny. That dog never left her. And Ranger here, he found them. Only then did Lily notice the German shepherd standing quietly at Ethan's side. She stepped forward hesitantly, then dropped to one knee and gently stroked Ranger's thick fur. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for finding my baby." Ranger leaned into the touch, eyes half closed. After a moment of stillness, Lily turned and looked Ethan in the eye. "Can I see her?" "You can. I'll drive you there now if you're ready." She nodded. "Just let me grab her blanket. She hates hospitals, always says they're too cold." Ethan smiled softly. She's a fighter. She'll be glad to see you." The third morning broke in Coldridge with a thin veil of sunlight pressing timidly through the snow-laced windows of the pediatric ICU. The storm had passed overnight, leaving behind a shimmering stillness that clung to the pine-covered hills like a breath held too long. Inside room 203, the hush was not of fear, but of waiting. Hope, so fragile and tender, hovered in the air like the steam curling from a mug of untouched tea. Ethan sat in a plastic chair beside the hospital bed, one hand loosely resting on his knee, the other absently rubbing the back of Ranger's neck. The German shepherd lay curled at his feet, alert but unmoving. On the bed, under layers of warmed blankets, Maddie's small frame stirred faintly. Her hair had been combed gently to one side by the night nurse, a soft pink band holding back the strands from her pale forehead. Monitors beeped with steady rhythm. Her temperature had stabilized at 36.1 degrees overnight. Her breathing no longer rattled. The nurse on duty, Caitlin Reese, moved with the quiet grace of someone who had worked enough night shifts to know when not to speak. She was in her early 30s, with dark auburn hair pinned in a loose braid, freckles across her cheeks, and a voice as soft as snowfall. She'd been assigned to Maddie's case since her arrival. Caitlin was known among staff not for dramatic diagnoses or speed, but for stillness, for being the person who stayed in the room when everyone else left. She never rushed children awake, never filled silence with false comfort. Her own son, born with a weak heart and lost at 2 months old, had made her into someone who knew exactly how to hold a fragile moment without breaking it. At 6:42 a.m., Maddie's eyelids fluttered. Ethan leaned forward slowly, heart hitching. Caitlin turned, then froze. She didn't speak, only stepped closer. Maddie blinked, long and slow, like surfacing from a dream she hadn't meant to wake from. Her eyes, soft hazel flecked with green, drifted across the sterile ceiling, then down toward the movement near her feet. Ranger had already risen to his elbows, watching her with quiet intensity. When her gaze finally met his, something sparked a shift in her face. The way her eyebrows pulled together, lips parted slightly. Ethan spoke gently. "Hey there, kiddo." Her head turned slowly, and she saw him. Her eyes registered confusion first, then fear. "It's okay, you're safe," he added, keeping his tone calm. "I'm Ethan. I found you out in the snow. Ranger here helped, and someone's been waiting to see you." At that, the door creaked open. Caitlin nodded once, and a moment later, Olivia, the head nurse, stepped in, carrying something small and wrapped in a blanket the color of sand. Benny. The little dog was clean now, his fur fluffed but still thin, a tiny pink bandage wrapped around one paw. He had slept almost non-stop since being rescued, but when he entered the room, his ears twitched. Then he whined, soft and urgent, wiggling free of Olivia's arms. Maddie's eyes lit up, lips trembling. She let out a whisper, barely a breath. "Benny!" Olivia stepped forward carefully, placing the dog onto the blanket near Maddie's side. Benny nosed her chest with unsteady excitement, then collapsed against her with a soft sigh. Maddie's fingers, stiff but responsive, moved through his fur. Her lower lip quivered, then broke into the faintest, most radiant smile Ethan had ever seen. And then, without hesitation, Ranger stepped closer and rested his broad head on the bed's edge. Maddie turned toward him, her fingers still buried in Benny's coat. She studied Ranger for a long moment, then slowly reached out. Her hand, small and trembling, found his snout. Ranger licked her palm gently, once, then settled in. Caitlin stepped back, eyes glassy. Ethan leaned his elbows on his knees, letting out a long, quiet breath. He had seen many things in his years on the force. Crashes, violence, grief, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped waiting for goodness to appear unannounced. But sitting there, in that quiet room, with a girl who should have died, and 2 dogs who hadn't left her side, something in him began to thaw, like ice melting at the edges of an old scar. Maddie turned to look at him again. "Are you the one who brought me here?" Ethan nodded. "Me and Ranger, but you helped too. You held on." She didn't answer. She just looked at Ranger again and whispered, "He's big." "He's a big softy," Ethan said. "Saved a few lives before yours, but I think he likes you best." She smiled again, brighter this time. Caitlin moved to check the IV, quietly scribbling on her chart. A moment later, Lily appeared at the door, her hair brushed back, wearing the same scarf Maddie had left on the couch, eyes rimmed red from crying, but glowing with something deeper now. Peace. Maddie saw her and gasped, "Mommy!" The heart monitor spiked for a moment as Lily rushed to the bedside. She knelt, holding her daughter's hand tightly, tears falling freely again, but this time they were warm, grateful tears. Ethan stood, backing away to give them space. Ranger followed him, stretching before settling by the door, head resting on his paws. He watched the family quietly, hand resting on Ranger's back. Something new had started here, not just for Maddie, but for himself. Something he hadn't allowed in for years. Belief. In second chances. In the idea that even the worst winters end. The morning of their discharge arrived with sunlight pouring through the windows, like warm syrup, melting the last edges of snow from the glass. In room 203 of Coldridge General, Maddie sat upright in her bed, her small legs dangling over the edge, pink socks barely brushing the floor. Her cheeks had gained back some color, and though her arms were still thin and her frame a little frail, her eyes were bright. Benny rested in her lap, tail thumping slowly with each soft stroke of her hand. Lily stood nearby, folding Maddie's spare clothes into a small duffel bag. She looked different now, her face no longer tight with grief, but flushed with relief, eyes softer, shoulders less tense. She wore a plain gray sweater and jeans, her hair tied in a neater bun. There was still a quiet hesitance in her movements, like someone recovering from a long nightmare, but there was strength underneath. It was the kind of strength that only comes from walking through fire and making it out the other side. Ethan leaned against the doorway, with Ranger sitting faithfully beside him, the German shepherd's gaze flicking between Maddie and Benny. The warmth in the room, the quiet joy, felt earned. "She looks good," Ethan said softly. "She's ready," Lily replied, "though I think she'd rather stay another night just to keep Benny under the heated blanket." Maddie smiled at that, but didn't look up. "He likes it here. He gets all the chicken he wants." Caitlin Reese entered with the discharge papers, her braid coiled tighter today. Blue scrubs, crisp and clean. "Everything's signed. Dr. Holloway says Maddie's clear to go. Just keep her warm, lots of rest, soft foods for a few days." She turned to the little girl. "And no snow for at least 2 weeks, okay?" Maddie raised her hand solemnly, like a promise. Benny yawned. As Lily zipped up the duffel, Ethan stepped forward, kneeling in front of Maddie. "Hey, before you go, I wanted to ask something." Maddie looked at him, tilting her head. "There's a program I work with. It's for kids who have gone through tough things, like accidents or trauma. It helps them heal by letting them work with animals, dogs, mostly. Sometimes they help train rescue pups or just spend time with them. But I think you and Benny could help other kids feel safe again." "You already helped me." Lily blinked, surprised. "You think she'd be able to?" "Only if you're comfortable," Ethan said. "It's not about pressure, just giving what she already has." Maddie glanced at Benny. The dog looked up at her, then licked her arm once, as if answering for both of them. "I want to," she said softly. "Can Ranger come too?" Ethan smiled. He'd like that. Later that week, the sun over Coldridge thawed the last of the icicles from the roofs, and Lily returned to her job at Maple and Birch, a small bakery nestled on Main Street. The shop sat on a corner lot with wide windows that always fogged up in winter and smelled like cinnamon and rising dough. The place had been struggling lately. Too many storms, not enough tourists, but regulars still stopped in for her lemon poppy seed muffins and honey wheat loaves. On Maddie's first day back with her mother, she wore a light yellow beanie and sat at the front corner table with Benny perched proudly in a cushion-lined basket at her feet. A handwritten sign, drawn by Maddie herself in marker, stood on the table. "Meet Benny, the snow hero." A small tin beside it read, "Tips for dog treats." The story of the storm rescue had already made its way through town. Ethan never intended for it to be public, but someone at the hospital had shared a photo with a local blog, and from there, it had traveled faster than a wind-blown flake. Now, customers came not just for scones, but to see Maddie's shy smile and pet the dog who'd stayed beside her in the storm. One customer, Mrs. Doreen Halpern, a retired school librarian in her 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair always tied in a scarf, visited every Friday morning. She brought peanut butter treats and called Benny Sir Benjamin like he was royalty. She'd lost her own grandson to pneumonia years ago and had adopted Maddie in her heart within minutes of meeting her. Benny soaked up the affection, but never strayed far from Maddie. He remained calm, loyal, and alert. His limp had improved, and his fur grew thicker each week. And Ranger, he visited often, Ethan would bring him by after patrol, and the German Shepherd would settle under the bakery table like he belonged there. Matty had started brushing his coat, speaking to him in hushed tones. Ranger always listened. Ethan had taken to staying for coffee when he dropped Ranger off. At first, it was quick grab a cup, nod at Lily, and leave. But over time, those visits lingered. He learned that Lily used to be a teacher before the bakery, that she lost her husband to cancer 4 years ago, and had since raised Matty alone, that she baked not for profit, but to remember her mother, who used to sing while kneading dough. And Lily learned that Ethan used to be different before his sister's death, that he had once dreamed of moving to Alaska to train avalanche dogs, that sometimes he still couldn't sleep if he didn't check the weather twice. But mostly, they both learned how to sit in silence that wasn't lonely. A full month had passed since that night, since the storm, the cold, the desperate drive, and the quiet fight for life. Coldridge now wore a gentler face. The snow had begun to recede, revealing the muddy browns and early greens beneath, like the town was slowly waking from a long sleep. On this late March afternoon, sunlight filtered through still bare branches, casting slivers of gold over the walking path that wound through Maple Ridge Park, where the ground was soft and damp, the air crisp but not bitter. Ethan walked slowly with Ranger, who moved with an easy grace, tail swaying at ease. His black and rust coat shimmered in the light, thick and well-brushed, thanks to a very dedicated little girl who insisted on grooming him each week at the bakery. Ethan wore his uniform pants, but no badge today, just a navy jacket and a wool scarf that still smelled faintly of flour and cinnamon. He wasn't on duty, he was somewhere in between, somewhere closer to home. As they rounded a bend near the edge of the park's frozen pond, he saw her. Maddie sat on a wooden bench under the sycamore tree that hadn't yet bloomed, a wool blanket around her shoulders and Benny curled at her side. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her boots muddy from wandering the grass, but her eyes were shining. She held something in her lap, a piece of thick art paper, slightly crinkled at the corners and colored in vibrant pastels. She jumped up when she saw them. "Ranger!" she called. The German Shepherd perked up and trotted ahead, his ears up, tongue lolling in excitement. Maddie dropped to her knees as he reached her, wrapping her arms around his neck. Benny wagged his tail and gave one bark, then nestled closer into Maddie's boots. Ethan reached them a moment later, smiling. "You promised you'd stay seated," he said, mock stern. "I tried," Maddie grinned, "but Ranger walks too slow when I'm sitting." She held out the drawing to him. "This is for you." Ethan took the paper carefully. The picture was unmistakable. 3 figures, 1 tall man, 1 big dog, 1 small girl holding a leash attached to a smaller dog. All were standing in snow, under a soft blue sky with flakes still falling. The tall man had dark brown hair and a badge drawn over his coat. The words at the bottom were written in blocky, uneven handwriting, but clear as day. "You saved us. All of us." Ethan's throat tightened as he crouched to her level. "This is the best thing anyone's ever given me." "It's true," she said simply. Then came Lily, walking down the slope from the park entrance with a paper bag in hand. She wore a light coat, a yellow scarf, and jeans with a faint flour stain near one knee. Evidence she'd come straight from the bakery. Her cheeks were wind-chilled, but her eyes crinkled with warmth when she saw Ethan holding the drawing. "Did she give it to you?" Lily asked as she arrived. Ethan stood, holding it up. "She did. I'm framing it." Lily smiled, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him without hesitation. It was soft, warm, and full of meaning. "Thank you," she said, "for bringing her back, for everything since." He didn't know what to say, so he hugged her back and let the silence do the speaking. That evening, Ethan returned with them to their small home tucked just beyond the tree line. It was warm inside, glowing with lamplight, and something else, something slower, deeper, and growing steadily. Dinner was chicken pot pie with mashed potatoes, followed by a lopsided apple tart that Maddie insisted on cutting herself, though her slices were wildly uneven. At the kitchen table, Ranger lay stretched out beneath Ethan's feet, his chin resting on one paw. Benny, in a favorite red sweater knitted by one of the bakery regulars, was curled in Maddie's lap, his nose tucked into the crook of her arm. They looked so at peace together that Ethan almost didn't want to move. At one point, Maddie leaned over and whispered something into Benny's ear. The little dog's ears twitched. Then she looked up at Ethan and asked, "Do you think dogs know what love means?" Ethan paused, looked down at Ranger, and then said, "I think they're the only ones who never forget." Lily glanced across the table at Ethan. Their eyes met. No need for words. Later, while Lily washed dishes and Maddie curled up with a book on the couch, Ethan stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand. The sky had shifted to lavender, the last light dancing along the snowy peaks far in the distance. The trees stood like sentinels in the fading glow, and for once, he didn't feel haunted by them. Behind him, he heard the soft pad of Ranger's paws. The shepherd sat beside him, exhaled deeply, and looked out toward the horizon as if to say, "We did it." Thus Ethan knelt beside him and rubbed his ears. "Yeah, bud, we really did." Sometimes, miracles don't come as flashes of light or heavenly voices. Sometimes, they come in the form of a loyal dog refusing to walk away, a child who never gives up on love, or a stranger who simply chooses to stop and care. In a world often cold and hurried, these moments, small as they seem, are the true work of God's hands. Maddie and Benny were not just saved from the snow that night. They were reminders that when we act with compassion, when we reach out even in uncertainty, we become instruments of grace. Maybe it was divine timing, maybe it was fate. But perhaps it was just one man, one dog, and one choice to not walk away. And in your everyday life, remember, love still rescues, kindness still heals, and miracles still walk among us, sometimes on four paws. If you believe God still works in quiet ways, if you believe every life, no matter how small, is sacred, type amen in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. And if you believe animals deserve love, not suffering, subscribe to the channel. Together, we can make this world a little softer, a little braver, a little more divine. God bless you wherever you are.